Well,
We should probably turn her sound off.
yeah. Although if she wants to, if Hayley wants to tell me something, I won't hear her. But she won't say anything during the talk. So yeah. Yeah. No, if I start.
So how do I get this off and then put side on?
I'll do it.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll just leave her finished.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Or when I'm introducing everything to her.
Yeah. What's that?
Yes, it is on the time.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. Hello to everyone here in the room. Hello to all the people joining us online. And this is a bit of a first, because this is the first in-person meeting that the East Midlands branch of the Royal Meteorological Society are doing. Thank you very much for choosing to host it at Nottingham as well. It's a pleasure to host the meeting here. We thought it was nice, Mike and I had a chat about this several months ago. We thought it'd be nice to actually take the meetings from being what historically has all been online to start doing them in person, now that we can do things in person again, which is lovely. So thank you very much to everyone for coming. I'm very much looking forward to hearing Saeed's talk today. It's on a topic that as a School of Geography we're really interested in. In our school we have lots of expertise in the field of climate change, also lots of interests in food security, particularly in terms of work that's been done in the field of rural geography and rural environmental geography as well. And also in climate change, we have numerous people in the school now, many staff, many researchers, PhD students, research staff as well, looking at topics around the broader issue of climate change, in which food security comes up many times. We also integrate a lot with the School of Biosciences. I know there's several people here from Biosciences, online and in person. So I'm very much looking forward to the talk. I'd like to thank Saeed for coming. What I want to do first is hand over to Mike, who chairs the East Midlands branch of the Royal Meteorological Society. Mike's just going to say a few words about the Society and also welcome our speaker formally. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Simon. First of all, welcome again to the East Midlands Centre of the Royal Meteorological Society. My name is Mike Stephen. I'm chairman of the local branch of the East Midlands Centre. The Society's mission is to strengthen the science of weather and climate and to raise public awareness of atmospheric science. Local centres such as the East Midlands, and there are many across the country, exist to bring the Royal Meteorological Society to its members in the region and also to broaden interest among the public at large. We also try, when appropriate, to promote local expertise in atmospheric science and other areas, related areas. A few housekeeping items to mention. First of all, we encourage you to ask questions of the speaker at the end of the presentation. If you're online, the way to do this is to click the question and answer button on your screen and type in your question. If you're here, the way to do it is to stick your hand up. And we will be alternating, so Simon and I will be co-chairing that section. I'll deal with the online questions and Simon will deal with the ones in the room. We also encourage you to engage further with the Royal Meteorological Society. There are various messages coming up here on rotation. You can sign up for the general interest newsletter Met Matters, which is absolutely free. For further engagement, you can join the Society. That's not free. And for further details of any of this, you can see the Royal Meteorological Society website, which is rmets.org. It now falls on me to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Saeed Azam-Ali. Saeed and I go back a very long way to when we were both at Sutton Bonington in the 1980s. He worked his way up at Sutton Bonington to a chair in global food security. He then went to the University of Nottingham, Malaysia campus, where he was vice provost, and then became founding CEO of Crops for the Future Research Centre. In 2020, he became CEO of Crops for the Future, CFF, which is based in Cambridge, and he was awarded OBE for services to underutilized crops and increasing global food security. Just this year, he was appointed to a high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition for the United Nations. And he's also recently written a book called The Ninth Revolution, Transforming Food Systems for Good, which I think is the topic of his talk tonight. So if I can hand over to Saeed for his talk.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you all for making the effort to come and see this talk. I'm going to go straight to the issue before we get into what I want to discuss, because this, whether we're food scientists or environmental scientists or geographers or members of the public, this is the most important slide I'm going to show tonight, because it shows the rise in food prices, which we're all familiar with, because we all recognize this cost of living crisis. But I don't think I've got a pointer thing, have I? But let me just take you through this sequentially. But if you just started 2020, we know what that is, a COVID pandemic. But look at the yellow line going up. And 2021, just ask anyone here to tell me what that picture represents, because it's rather unrepresented in the public media. But have you heard of the Ever Given? Do you remember the Ever Given? So here's a boat stuck in the Suez Canal, and it was stuck there for 6 days. And in 6 days, $36 billion of trade was stopped by that one boat. Because whilst that canal is 193 meters wide, it carries 12% of the world's trade. And Mike mentioned the University of Nottingham Malaysia campus, but in that part of the world, the Malacca Straits are only 2.7 kilometers wide. So if you add those two waterways, less than 3 kilometers of water determine almost 90% of the world's trade by ship. Now, if you actually block it, you can see the consequences here. And of course, that means trade, but it also means food. It also means perishable goods. It means all the things that we depend on in terms of a commodity-based economy. And of course, you see price rises. But 2022 is, of course, a war in Europe again. And if we just look at that in the food context rather than the wider political context, the Ukraine and Russia, between them, produce 28% of the world's wheat, 29% of the world's barley, 15% of the world's maize, and 75% of the world's sunflower. So these two countries and the region that they represent are really massive food exporters. And we saw the consequence of the blockage of the Black Sea and the consequences we've seen in terms of food being distributed around the world from these two countries. But we often think about Russia as an energy power, and we of course think of buying fossil fuels and gas from Russia. It's also the largest exporter of nitrogen fertilizer on the planet, the second of potash, and the third of phosphorus. So here we are dependent on not just energy, but the fertilizers that service the food system and these crops. And that demonstrates, and we're still only in 2022, and of course we know what's going on in the world now, 2023, we don't yet know what the consequences of the global geopolitical situation is to food prices. And if we go back to the last time this happened, you can see a parallel, almost parallel line in 2008, 2010. And that represents the last time food prices increased dramatically. And it resulted in food riots in 60 places and in 30 countries. And what became known as the Arab Spring was a consequence of food price rises. So we're really dealing here with something which is global, is significant, and is a subject, whether we are particularly interested academically, we're all interested in food personally because we eat, but the consequences of food price increases, and this is a piece of bread tied to this gentleman's head, but this represents the consequences of not feeding people. And that essentially says we have a vulnerable agri-food system. And for most of my career, we've not really considered food as a very important issue because there was plenty of it and it was easily available and we could trade it around the world and it was on our supermarket shelves. So that really sets a context in which things will never be the same again in terms of the food system. We'll never get cheap food again, and we'll have to think very hard about how we satisfy the food requirements currently of 8 billion people, but by 2050 for 10 billion people. And this is the food system that we all are familiar with. But we don't recognize, in fact, probably very few of you here will say only 4 crops provide 60% of the world's calories. Yet we've got 500,000 plant species. We've got 7,000 crops that we've grown throughout our history as farmers. And about 100 crops now account for 99% of our food, but 4 crops produce 60%, over 60% of the food of 8 billion people. And you can see them because you know them, you eat them, you eat their products. So wheat, rice, soy, and maize now produce 60% of the world's calories under one cropping system, monoculture. So an industrial monoculture, a fossil food system based on fossil fuels, is what actually satisfies or meets the needs of most of humanity, because that food is distributed around the world and those 4 crops are ubiquitous. Whether we grow rice in Britain, we eat rice. Whether we grow wheat in sub-Saharan Africa, people eat wheat. So this is really, these are global crops, they're massive, and they're the basic subsistence of how we actually live on this planet, because we depend on those 4 crops. Not just for food, and I'll just take you one example. Let's take maize, or corn as it's called in America. And it's not just food, so we can look at what is corn used for, or maize used for. It's used as a biofuel, it's used for fodder, it's used as an animal feed, and it's used as a high fructose corn syrup, which is almost in all processed foods, as a cheap source of glucose. So these 4 other uses, and I'll just give you an example. In the USA, 1% of maize is eaten. The rest goes into high fructose corn syrup, animal feed, or biofuel. So you can see the importance of this crop, not just as a food crop. It's a food crop, but it's used for almost everything else as well. So we take it out of circulation for whatever reason. Suppose there was a pandemic tomorrow and maize stopped being produced. And of course, with climate change, increasingly maize is under stress anyway. That consequence is not just for our food system, but it's for our whole economic system, that crop and the other 3 crops are now the source, in fact, of our whole basic economy. Now, we've been warned because Sir John Beddington, who then was just finished very soon after this speech as being the UK government chief scientific advisor, and he made a speech in 2009. And in that speech, he introduced this term, the perfect storm. And he talked about a perfect storm of food shortages, scarce water, and insufficient energy resources threaten to unleash public unrest, cross-border conflicts, and mass migration as people flee from the worst affected regions. Well, that sounds pretty much like where we are now. He said it would be 2030 because we head into a perfect storm in 2030 because all of these things are operating on the same time frame. And that was before a pandemic, because he hadn't factored that in, and we hadn't factored another war in Europe. So you can see his prophecy was already, it's prescient because we're here now with what he described as a perfect storm in 2030. So we're now here in a perfect storm, and the food system is critical to how we get out of the perfect storm. So just to summarize where we are, the context for the talk. In my talk, I want to start from saying that we grow too few crops in too few exporting regions, and we transport them and their products along too few vulnerable supply chains to billions of consumers around the world. It's a very, very narrow base on which we all increasingly depend, and it's something which we have almost stumbled into, but we've come to this position that we're in now because of the homogenization of our food system over the last 50 years by something called the Green Revolution. And those 4 crops are the consequence or the success stories, if you like, of the Green Revolution. So that business as usual, 4 crops supporting humanity through one cropping system is our current model. That's the business as usual model. And anyone who's talking about let's keep doing more of business as usual is essentially saying we'll do what we're doing better rather than we'll do something different, because no one's changed that model yet. And what I'm going to say in this talk is that that business as usual model is not an option. If we're going to nourish 10 billion people, because currently we feed them, but we don't nourish them, calories are not the only ingredients that we actually need for a healthy diet, we're going to have to nourish not just 8 billion, but 10 billion people by 2050 on a hotter planet. And we have to do that if we're to avoid the perfect storm. And of course, I'm not going to go into the detail, but the Sustainable Development Goals, which we all have heard of, 17 goals. Goal number 1, 0 poverty anywhere. SDG 2, 0 hunger anywhere by 2030, in 7 years. And the SDG 2 is actually 0 hunger and improved nutrition. So we've got a lot to achieve in 7 years. And that business as usual is really not going to get us there. And this slide illustrates why, and I can just explain. Mike mentioned our joint careers at Sutton Bonington. Well, in Sutton Bonington, we set up a climate change unit, which we looked at the effect of carbon dioxide concentrations on tropical crops. And that was back here in the late 90s, mid-1980s. And at that time, the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, because we did these glasshouse experiments where we doubled it, we set the mean atmospheric CO2 in our glasshouses as 350, and our double was 700. So it's 350 then. When I was born, it was 300, and now in this room, it's 490. Well, not in the room, but in the atmosphere around us, it's 419, 420. So in my lifetime, carbon dioxide concentration is increased by 100. And the pre-industrial revolution CO2 concentration was 280. So this is, we all talk about unprecedented and, really dramatic changes, but this is absolutely dramatic. And at the same time, of course, we see the temperature increase and global warming temperature increases over 1 degree in that period since we started work on tropical crops here in Nottingham. Now, why do I say we can't address that without addressing the food system? Because agriculture and forestry is responsible for about 1/4 of carbon emissions. But that is only part of the story, because agriculture, forestry, and other land use is 24%. But don't forget, agriculture is an industry. Don't forget the food system involves transportation. These are not factored into that. These are not part of the calculation of the total impact on the environment that agriculture has. So the agri-food system now is actually the biggest cause of climate change. So it's the elephant in the room. Without addressing the food system, we cannot hope to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, 1.5 Paris target. We can almost forget anyway, but we're never going to get there unless we absolutely transform the food system. And that's going to need radical change. So that's the context. And I want to then give you an example from my own research, and particularly of the centre that Mike has mentioned, Crops for the Future, because the whole point of Crops for the Future is we have to do things differently. And to do that, we're going to have to look at these crops, or these species. But they are crops because we've grown them in our historical past, last 10,000 years. We farmed for about 10,000 years, and in that time we farmed about 7,000 plants. But we're down to 100, and we're down to 4 for most of our food. I'm not talking about the 500,000 in nature of natural biodiversity. I'm talking about the 7,000 crops that we actually have got experience of, but we no longer grow. And we call them underutilized, forgotten, neglected, minor, orphan. These are all pejorative terms. No one says orphan and minor, saying, isn't this good? We're saying these are crops that aren't of any importance to us. and they're often described sometimes as women's crops because they're considered, women look after their families in sub-Saharan Africa when the men's crops fail. And it's women's crops that actually sustain people because they're growing these crops while their men folk are growing maize and trying to grow soy and other crops. So our question is, can some of these be crops of the future? And if they can't, we better know. And if they can, we better do something with them because these are crops that we have got here somewhere in our head, but we haven't done research on them. Underutilized crops are under-researched crops. Oh, and just to make that point, I don't pretend the 3.5 is correct, but it's going to have to be on a much hotter planet. And yeah, we can argue whichever prediction we use, is it going to be 2.4 or is it going to be 5.7? That's the range. I'm probably out of date now, but those are the figures that I think are reported ranges for different scenarios for climate change. Anyway, it's going to be hotter. More than that, the amplitude. And of course, crops don't go indoors and hide from the sun, so they have to live with amplitude and frequency and distribution of weather events. So this average doesn't really mean much unless we know that our locality is going to get much more extreme events. And we see that, and we of course experience that much more in our own personal lives, whether we're farming or not. We see these extremes that are happening literally as we speak now in terms of rainfall events. So Crops for the Future is the only centre that was set up with a mandate to look at underutilised and forgotten crops as its only job. Now, of course, a lot of places, including the university here, will say we work on underutilised crops, but that's not their day job. That's work they do as well as all the other things they do. Crops for the Future was set up specifically and exclusively to look at underutilised crops. Why? Because there was so little work being done on underutilised crops, we felt we had to put all of that effort into one place to get critical mass. Otherwise, it always fell below the if you like, the threshold that people use to fund research, etc. And in this talk, and I'll take you through as quickly as I can these three areas, I'm going to talk about how Crops for the Future has developed knowledge systems for underutilised crops, has looked at networks so that we build critical mass of expertise and practical evidence on these crops, and really very importantly, products from them. Because if we can't make products from them, we can conserve their germplasm, we can keep them in gene banks, we can store the seeds, but if we're not using those, we're not actually making much progress in terms of these species becoming, again, useful to humanity and to the planet. So, I might just stop if there's any questions you need, or somebody wants to just ask. Well, is that all right if I just ask if there's any quick question or clarification just while we set the scene? Please.
Your figure for agriculture and its impact on climate change, of that 24% or whatever it was, what proportion of that is land use change?
A lot of it is land use change, and land use change is the one big thing that's still happening. Because of course, we can get into all the arguments about, alternative proteins, but there's still been clearing land to grow soy or pea to produce alternative proteins from vegetable sources. So land change is still, agriculture is still expanding into natural vegetation, and the change, especially in regions that I've worked in, Southeast Asia, for instance, the deforestation there is critical to the to the total cost of the carbon emissions coming from agriculture. Yeah. Please.
Do we know, or do we have that reason why from the 7,000 we started evolving to then just 100 and then like 4 crops?
You have to read the book. No, it's essentially economies of scale. The whole green revolution was about crops that produce high yields, which mean high amounts of calories, because yield was measured effectively as weight, and those crops were then seen as easy to manage mechanically, provide irrigation, fertilizer, all the things that made farming easier and easy to mechanize and digitize. And those other crops invariably produce lower yields, so they were always reduced in terms of yield, because we weren't measuring nutritional content, for instance. We were saying the yield, calories. A lot of these unutilized crops are nutritious, therefore they contain high amounts of proteins and vitamins, etc. Well, they don't come out in the weight comparison with the major crops. So they got displaced and then later on stigmatized as being crops of the past. You know, this was always the case, that they're poor people's crops. They're not crops you aspire to, which produce high yields and can be easily mechanized. So that's the historical sequence of those crops being marginalized, and then later on, you know, all of their knowledge systems were actually lost, which is what we're really struggling to reassess, is that knowledge. Okay, I'll take you through this quickly, but I know it's available later on if you want to. This is going to be available, isn't it? The recording, if you want to go through this. But the first thing we said was, let's have a knowledge system for unutilized crops. There isn't one. And when we went to the FAO and we said, thank you, when we said there must be a knowledge system, the FAO, United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, must collect data on all these other crops that we don't consider important on a global scale. Well, they don't, because there's something called the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, mouthful, but there's only 64 crops in that treaty. So if you're in one of the 64 crops, you as a country return data on that crop to the United Nations. If you're not in the top 64, you don't have to provide data. So the UN is not collecting data. So that data isn't in a form that we could use to say, look, we're going to produce data from the United Nations on these crops. So we said, we're going to have to do it ourselves. And then we said, if we're going to do it, it's got to be objective, but it's also got to include the evidence of farmers themselves. Because what we call vernacular information, people's heads, is where most of that knowledge is still stored. Because it doesn't go into Nature articles very often, it doesn't go into scientific publications. It goes from generation to generation through people's own knowledge of these crops. That is very hard in institutions to justify that this is something which you call research, because it's not immediately evident as scientific evidence. So we said we're going to produce a knowledge system that includes everything. You know, farmers' data, your own data, your mother and grandmother's recipes, everything we can find on these crops. So we take a crop here and we say, here's the crop-specific knowledge, you know, the agronomy and the food and socioeconomics, etc. Where we have that evidence, we'll put it in. Then we say, can we do some measurements to actually measure their nutrition? When people claim they're good for you, is there evidence for that? Where's the science base? And then we say, let's put all the other stuff in. Let's put photos of them. Let's put locational information, people's own memories of these crops. We'll put all of that into a database, a knowledge system, which we call CropBase. And here you can see we use public information and big data wherever possible. Where that was crowdsourced or where that was in international database, of course, we could access it, but we had to use data processing engines and machine learning to try and bring all that data into form that was interoperable between the different databases. And then we developed two applications which can be used and are available if you want to log into them, Select Crop and Assess Crop. And these two applications essentially say, can I grow it here? And if I do, what would the yield now and in the future? What are the climate, you know, what would the yield in different climate scenarios? And then what's in it? What are the nutritional ingredients, micronutrients, macronutrients? Because without that, it's difficult to justify why we should grow these crops, because they haven't got any products that we can justify their value, or at least their nutritional value from them. And here's the meteorological data, and I'm saying all of this, but my colleague, Dr. Ibrahim Jahanshiri, is the head of the CropBase program, and I'm just listing all of the information that he uses from meteorological data in CropBase. And much of that, of course, is public domain, but then we have to use bias correcting, etc., so that we can take that data into a form that we can provide as the best available evidence, which is much more difficult on unutilized crops, because it's not easy just to go to the literature and find the data. And again, Select Crop says, so if you just imagine you're in a location, you're in one place on the planet, and you go, what is the potential of plants that aren't the mainstream crops? What could I grow in my location? What would the performance be? Of course, we have to use data systems for that. And then projections, so we can look at heat and drought and rainfall and patterns that we can build in to look at climate, different climate scenarios. And then we list those crops for that location. And it's, in a sense, the easiest thing to do is say, I can grow it here, because you can try it and you can plant it, some seeds, and the seeds grow and you say, great. But actually, that isn't enough. We've got to be able to say, if I grow it here, is it better than what we've already got? You know, will it get me a better return, either in yield or in nutrition? Is it climate resilient? And is it a better choice for farmers who have to take the risk? We're not taking the risk. They have to plant crops that they have to see a livelihood from, and we have to give them the best evidence possible that the crops they grow have got the highest potential. Please.
With the economic potential, how you confident about the 64 crops before you've got the world data?
We've got the world data for the 64 crops, and we've got some data for these crops, but we do them as basically as farm calculations, yield, and what would be the general market price. So we do a farm economics of it, farm level economics of that crop.
And country specific as well. So it's specific factors.
Specific, yeah. And of course, the data's scanty, so you know, don't think everything I'm showing you is perfect. It's just the structure is there. As we get better data and as we get updates, that data will become more reliable and the predictions will become better. But you can do this. You can go to a location, you type in your location, and it will say, okay, these are the crops that you could get in your location. So I picked a random example somewhere in India there, and these are the crops, and they all sound familiar. If you're in India, cashew, foxtail millet, even cauliflower, these are crops that you could grow in your location. But what we've done is we've ranked them. So you say, I want the 10 highest yielding crops. That will give you a ranking. Or I want the 10 most nutritious crops, and that will give you a different ranking. Or I want the 10 most climate resilient crops, which will give you a ranking. They won't be the highest yielding, but every year I'll get something from them. That's really the purpose of doing this. So it's comparative, and we put big data on the big crops in as well, so that you're growing this crop, and here's the main crop. You know, which one would you be better off growing for that location, and for what purpose? And just for fun, I put the Maid Marian Way in. And if you went to Maid Marian Way, there's not much farming there, I know, but the location you could put in, you get old man saltbush, you get blue bunch wheatgrass, all of which we know very well, bladderpod and bramble wattle. So, you know, species can be grown here that we won't be familiar with. You might then say, well, that's interesting. Maybe we could do something and just test whether this works. And if we did test it, what might you get out of? Now, we just had a workshop, not workshop, but a national roundtable on agricultural diversification in Cambridge on the 10th of October, which Princess Royal chaired. And that was to do exactly this, to see which crops. Because the UK, 75% of the agriculture area of the UK is occupied by 3 crops. And we import 50% of our food from the European Union. So it is a very odd situation that we've got so few crops, because agriculture is, of course, a mainstay of the British economy for generations. Of course, the land and the topography of Britain is very diverse. So you would think there'd be more than 3 crops that can be successfully farmed here, but there are only 3 crops that are actually 75% of the land area of arable agriculture. Now, I'm going to give you 2 case studies, both of which I suspect you don't know. One's called Bambara grana, Vigna subterranea, and it obeys our sort of primary rules for an unutilized crop. Is it nutritious? Will it grow fast? And is it climate resilient? So has it got this robust characteristic? And what are the nutritional contents? So we've worked on this crop for a long time, and it's an example here in the northern province, Kedah, northernmost province of Malaysia, farmer growing Bambara grana, but it's a crop of African origin, and it's grown. Centre of diversity is the Jos Plateau in Cameroon and Nigeria. But we made products from it. In fact, the author of the first vegetable milk on Bambara grana is in this room, so a long time ago. So here we are, looking at this crop, and you just got to say, well, okay, let's just see what this could do. What could we do with this unutilized crop? Which, has anyone heard of it, just out of interest? No. Oh, somebody has. Somebody has to have had. And there's another one called moringa, which is sometimes called the miracle tree. It's drought tolerant. It has all these other characteristics I've mentioned. It's climate resilient, fast growing. Growing outside our house on a road verge in Malaysia, the campus that we lived on, Country Heights. And it grows wild, because it's basically a wild tree from the Himalayas that's been spread by human beings, because it's the drumstick tree. And if you've ever had dal and these long pods, those long pods are moringa. but it also produces these very delicate leaves, it produces flowers, it fixes nitrogen, it's wood can be used for firewood and for biomass. So again, it's a complete product if you used all the ingredients. So these are the two crops, and I'm just going to give you examples of our work on these two crops to give what we call exemplar crops, because we can't do 7,000 crops. So which crops can we do that illustrate the principles of climate resilient crops for the future? And here, way back in 2002, we produced a global map of a crop that originates from here, sub-Saharan Africa, but according to this map on a 50 by 50 kilometer grid on a world scale, could be grown in Australia. It hasn't been. It could be grown in South Asia, and particularly the subcontinent. It hasn't been much. And it could be grown in Southeast Asia, where it is grown. And it's grown in Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia as a small-scale crop. But it's a crop from Africa that's now grown in other parts of the world. It could be grown here. And interestingly, I can't reach it, but the Mediterranean basin, according to the prediction, would be the best place to grow. It fits all the right criteria. The day length, the temperature, the rainfall, etc., would all be right for this crop. It's never been grown in North Africa and the Mediterranean region. So that was the prediction. Of course, it's a map. At the end of the day, it's as good as the data you put in it. But here's the sort of evidence we've produced. It's still mapping, but it now gives us some more, if you like, granularity to this. So we asked the question, soybean is one of the big four crops. It's a huge import requirement, or it's produced on a very large scale in certain parts of the world. Origin is actually China. And what we did was we produced a map of China and said, here are the areas that soybean is grown in. Could we grow Bambara groundnut instead of soybean? And we showed that here's the China soybean map, and here's the China. I didn't do exactly the same, the same diagram, but this blue area, light blue and dark blue, is where Bambara groundnut projections could be grown. And if that was the case, we've seen geographical potential for a crop, not just in a new country, but in areas that are going to be too dry for soybean and become increasingly marginal for mainstream agriculture. We could be growing another crop that does the job, produces protein, but it would also be seen as not just an import substitute, but a crop that would actually enhance soil and rehabilitate tired soils because of nitrogen fixation in dry environments. So we can do that on a map scale, on a country scale, and here's a map of Italy. And in this case, we do it the other way around. Say we've got a country, how many crops and which crops could we grow there? And in this case, we get the location and we put that on a national scale. And on the national scale, we can rank these crops, and by colour, you can see the different crops that would be suited. I think 553 crops were listed in that ranking as potential. Now we're dealing with maps and predictions and models and all the other things that give it uncertainty. But the biggest uncertainty is not knowing anything about what you could grow. This gives us the first step towards what you could grow, and then from that, you can rank which ones would be the best for your location and for your purposes. But can you make anything from it? So Assess Crop, this other app, now looks at the nutritional content. And it says, okay, what's the energy, protein, lipid, carbohydrate, etc. content? Importantly, what are the micronutrients? Because one of the features of these crops is that they're micronutrient rich, and our diets are micronutrient poor. And we have hidden hunger, we have obesity, where people are overfed, but actually micronutrient deficient. And we could actually get those micronutrients if these crops that we propose were rich in them, because the major crops aren't. And importantly, can we use them to make products as functional ingredients in foods that we're familiar with, but we can introduce them as an ingredient in those foods, either to make those ingredients go further or to increase the nutritional content of the foods we already eat. We use this term forgotten foods, which are the foods of our ancestors. And here we could look at, people will say, well, my grandmother's recipe is fantastic, it tastes great. She always used to tell us it was good for us when we had flu or whatever. Well, we can look at the nutritional content of those recipes and reassess them scientifically, but at the same time, keep those recipes alive, because of course they're passed from generation to generation. So we can collect the recipes and then test them in terms of their nutritional content. Just a little bit of data, but it illustrates how we produced noodles from those two crops that I mentioned, Bambara grana and moringa. And we produced them here just to show, all you've got to look at really is the blue lines are wheat noodles on their own. The orangey lines are wheat with 20% Bambara groundnut flour supplement. And the grey lines are 94% wheat with 6% moringa. That's these ones. Now, what we need to look at is, are they above blue? Are they above the wheat noodles? Because in Malaysia and Southeast Asia and Singapore, wheat is imported from the Midwest in the USA to make noodles that people eat in Southeast Asia. And wheat noodles are the priority, or wheat and rice noodles, but wheat noodles are ones that people are familiar with eating. Can we make them healthier and still not change people's habits, but the nutrition as well, and crops that they can grow themselves? So yes, magnesium, better than blue, phosphorus, potassium, and of course the letters indicate statistical differences, so, not much in calcium, but the principle is, in almost all cases, the lines are as good or better than wheat.
Would it take the same amount of land and resources to make?
It would grow on land that's currently not used, because if you're in marginal areas where, of course, wheat isn't grown in Southeast Asia, but if it were, you can't grow wheat, so you grow rice. Now, increasingly, rice is becoming unsustainable. I'll come to that just towards the end. But marginal lands, which are poor in soil, are actually the sorts of soils that these crops will grow in. So we're dealing here not with wild landscapes, but with land that are tired soils that are no longer suitable for mainstream agriculture, not to mention the heat and the climate change effects that are also coming in. So we can do that. We can then put it into characteristics like, children's daily requirements, adults' requirements, etc. So we can say, could we improve people's nutrition by better diets rather than tablets? And could we do it by crops that they could grow, or that could be grown locally, that could be part of their diet? And Martin Broadley, who has done wonderful work at Nottingham, is now at Rothamsted most of the time, produced some outstanding work on maternal health in Malawian mothers and the effect of increasing their nutritional content in ingredients from underutilized crops instead of giving them tablets. And that nutrition led them to rediscover some of their recipes, which were traditional foods of Malawi. Like,
What do they taste like?
well, the key question is, if we put too much in, people would recognize they taste different. So functionality has to be, how much could you increase the ingredients without changing the taste or the texture or the flavor? And what we found is, in general, we could get to about 50% change without people, and not just humans, but fish as well, because we used this for aquafeed. And when we started using insect meal instead of fish meal, you can only go so far before the fish recognize it's not fish. So at that point, we had to stop at 70% replacement. Well, I'll take that. If you're saving 70% of the South China Sea from catching fish to feed fish, that's good enough for me. If it's not 100%, it's still relevant. It's still a major contribution. But these are not changing people's habits. It's simply changing the ingredients in the products they're familiar with eating. Crop-based can also be used for this very important job, which is to collect before it disappears indigenous knowledge. Because that is we talk about genetic resources and we're losing genetic resources. Of course, that's true, but we can store them. But we can't store vernacular information. When it's unpublished, it's unwritten, it's in people's heads. Each generation, that knowledge is lost. And it's a race against time to store that knowledge, whether we use it or not. If we can't keep that knowledge, we've never got access to 10,000 years sometimes of information on these crops. So here we can see crop bases used. Here's our Bambara groundnut again, but we've got a farmer in Namibia, farmers in Ghana, traders in Indonesia, our farmers in Malaysia, all linked together with the CFF database to actually collect and share that knowledge, and increasingly share it so that we can actually provide engagement between these farmers who have never met each other to say, actually, you're growing the same crop. Would you like to share information with your farming counterpart in sub-Saharan Africa, who's also growing this crop, but we've never been able to put you together before, so we had a database which we could actually give to you and to them to actually populate. Okay, networks. So networks is really about these unutilized crops don't have global effort on them. They're not part of international centers and international research institutes, and they're not supported by United Nations agencies. But here's the sort of crops that we're looking at. We're saying, okay, these are the sorts of crops that we can produce. Genetic resource networks, so amaranth, wing bean, bambara groundnut, 2 millets, all of these crops are now being linked together through genetic resource conservation and exchange through these exchange programs. And of course, genetic resources leads to breeding. Can we breed? And there's an example of a global network of breeding on bambara groundnut, which Nottingham is one of the network that we put together in Asia, in Australia, and in Africa, and in Europe. So breeding is also the critical next step as well. We've got genetic resources. Can we characterize and improve those genetic resources to make them more useful? We were very honoured to have, who is now the King, but he was then the Prince of Wales, came to Malaysia to our centre to launch the Forgotten Foods Network, and that links what I mentioned, these recipes and foods and ingredients and stories. All of those things are relevant. They wouldn't go into traditional, conventional scientific publications, but they're critical to us because they give us the first lead to saying what could we do with these crops. This is what people are telling us, and we can link that with evidence, both circumstantial and vernacular and scientific, and of course products, because products are key. Without products, it's very difficult to see how we can break through this logjam, if you like, of the big crops being the only crops that people are interested in. We have a global manifesto, which is basically saying we've got to have a global effort on this, and the manifesto calls for concrete actions that contribute to achieve several of the Sustainable Development Goals, and very importantly, the right to food and the right to health, which are embedded in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. So knowledge about unutilized crops is part of a human right, because food should be a human right, and the right to food should be a human right and a public good, not a commercial. We call them commodity crops because they're basically traded, when in fact crops and food should be human rights. We're just in discussions now to have a European manifesto, but we already have one in Asia and Africa, and the global plan was launched in 2021 in Rome. So we have a global manifesto. Projects in Europe, where we have a project called Radiant, which is putting together 28 partners in 12 countries, of which Nottingham and the James Hutton Institute in Scotland are members. And that network is bringing together expertise and interestingly, chefs and people working on these crops and making products from them across Europe. So that's the first evidence, really, of a European effort on underutilized crops. And a very important project we've just finished called Land Support, which produces a decision support system for locations across the European Union for land use. And that could be urban land use, peri-urban land use, agriculture, food, whatever you want, forestry, the decision-making tool is there and we put in underutilized crops as one of the parts of the decision support system. So those maps of Italy were part of the land support effort to actually look at crops that we could grow in Europe in future climates on a quantitative basis, on a geographical information system and decision support system. That project's just come to an end. It is now part of European policy in Austria and Hungary, and Italy, one region of Italy. Finally, products, and what are we going to do with these products? Can we make them? Well, we're not a commercial company. We don't make products and sell them, but we can do the proof of concept. So you saw that a vegetable milk from bambara groundnut, the noodles we've mentioned already from moringa, and we take it to this stage, which is the proof of concept prototype. We make the product, test it, do the taste analysis, nutritional content, composition analysis of the ingredients, and then companies take this on. And a company in Singapore, for instance, now makes commercial noodles from those three, from bambara gram and moringa, and it sells these noodles not just in Southeast Asia, but increasingly in the USA. And their milk, which they're selling as a vegetable milk, is on sale in the USA. So these are products now which are actually an African crop going beyond Africa to markets where you would never have heard of that crop, but now becoming something that people aspire to or particularly seek out, that they can actually drink or eat from ingredients from these crops. And we're testing these sorts of products, which are proof of concept. So if you're in Italy, you want to have a biscotti, well, you can make it from bambara gram. Does it taste as good? Well, I would say yes, but I'm not Italian. And people might say no. We can make really elegant foods like dragon fruit. You've seen dragon fruit, the red, very, very attractive fruit, but not very tasty. It doesn't taste of anything. But you can make it into tortellini and compare it with Italian pastas. Kedongdong is a very astringent, high vitamin C bush that grows in marginal soils. And of course, it could compare with, lemon. And instead of lemonade, where of course you are growing lemons and you can do that, but increasingly we can start looking at local crops that provide the equivalent of a high vitamin C fruit drink. And I think this one is probably the most important, is refugees in Africa. This is this is humanitarian aid to refugee camps in Rwanda. Not for Rwandans, but for the surrounding countries where refugees actually come to Rwanda. And those refugees are then provided with humanitarian daily rations, very generously provided by the people of the USA. Imported. Maize, soy, wheat, same ingredients. So they're getting those ingredients. We could make moringa soup. And that moringa soup could be tasty and nutritious and grown locally by the refugees, or grown locally by people who then would have an economic driver, because there's 65 million refugees in the world. And why can't we make nutritious and tasty food for them from ingredients that don't have to be imported from the mainstream crops? And the fact that we could serve that at the banquet for the then Prince of Wales, and they thought it was quite good, is good enough for us. But you could make products specifically from local crops as humanitarian aid or refugee assistance. So we could reimagine it right to the point where if you went to the Loudon Co-op, you could have a beer made from fonio grown in the Sahel of Africa. And it's called hungry rice, not because it's a poor rice alternative, but it grows on marginal soils and it grows very quickly and it's very nutritious. But it's now brewed by Brooklyn Brewery, by a partner of ours, very strong champion of ours, Chef Pierre Thiam, set up a company, but also he works with the Brooklyn Brewery to make beer from fonio, which if you can buy in the Loudon Co-op means we made something, it's all at the Co-op now. So there you go. That's the potential of underutilized crops if we can break that ceiling, because it has to be acceptable. I mean, no one's going to drink beer they don't like drinking because it's made out of fonio. It's got to taste as good or better than the beers they're familiar with, but the potential is there. And have I got a couple of minutes left? Yeah, just to finish off. And these are the real questions we need to ask. And they're the hard questions. We've been saying, here's some underutilized crops, let's grow them, let's see what we can make from them, let's try and make some products from them. We're going to have to really ask some serious questions about whether we can carry on with the crops we already have. Rice effectively evaporates at the potential evaporation rate throughout its life, because it's a submerged crop and it's growing in water in paddy fields. Yeah, we can look at the global area under cultivation. We know it's massive. We know it's one of the big four crops. We know it produces high yields. Let's look at another crop. It's another millet. Fonio is a millet, but here's pearl millet. Crop I actually did my PhD on a very long time ago. And of course, it produces lower yields on a smaller scale. But if we looked at the efficiencies, if we started from scratch and said, which of those two crops would you grow now, given we know what the circumstances of our habits have been for the last 60 years in growing crops, all the bold, so I'm just looking down a list here, radiation use efficiency, transpiration, how much does it produce per unit of radiation, how much does it use per unit of, how much does it produce unit of transpiration, what's its carbon footprint, what are the nutritional contents of a crop that's hardly been improved compared to rice, which had had billions invested in it for its improvement. And every bold item there is better for millet than it is for rice. So higher radiation use, higher water, 5 grams instead of 5 grams per litre instead of 1.8, for example. Carbohydrate, okay, pretty much the same, but again, we've got more protein, lipid, zinc, iron, and it's a lower glycemic index. So starting from scratch, we might have to ask that question: which of those crops would you grow if were making that decision now, rather than everyone likes rice, so we've got to make rice better, or we've got to make rice grow in difficult environments? We might just have to say, we're going to have to stop growing rice. We're going to have to grow other crops that will feed us and nourish us and do less damage to the planet. And that's what we have to move towards investing in, because they've not had the investment. Had we had the investment over the last 200 years that rice has had on pearl millet, we would have overcome a lot of the obstacles to it, like hard to cook, it's grey, sometimes the processing is difficult, etc. But all those things are over. Those are the problems with the big crops before, once we started working on them. So let's finish with, I think you know the phrase, it's the economy stupid. Well, I would say it's the food system stupid, because we've been looking in the wrong place. If we want to address the issue of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, if we want to address the issue of hotter planet, the place to start is to look at the food system, because without changing the food system, there's not a chance of addressing climate change or the sustainable development goals, because we're doing basically more of the same, and we haven't got time for that. So we really have to make some very hard decisions, but it isn't that we're doing something that's unnecessary or impossible. It's a political will, and whether we do the research often depends on whether our politicians provide the incentives for us to do that. But my hypothesis is, without doing that, we can't lower that bit, let alone the other bits of a globalized food system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Saeed. We have time for some questions. How do I find the questions on here? Let me have a look. Sorry. Slowly catch your breath. Be on the Teams page.
So have we got any questions in the room first? Yeah.
So a lot of the agricultural practices that are linked with industrialised monoculture, a lot of led to degradation of soil, reduced nutrient content, erosion, compaction. Are the practices that you're recommending to grow these consistent with the move towards regenerative agriculture?
Yeah, they might not be, because at the moment I haven't talked about cropping systems, I only talk about crops. You could grow an unutilized crop as badly as you grow a mainstream crop with as much damage. So at the end of the day, if you mechanize and industrialize and throw fertilizer and nutrients and fossil fuels at it, it'll do the same thing. But if it's part of a movement to say, actually you can change the farming system as well, so we can go for intercropping these crops, and we can look at agroecological methods of growing them. Because the one thing they have, well, the reason why they're not mainstream crops is often because they're difficult to mechanize, they're difficult to process, they're difficult to grow as monocultures. So we might want to then embrace what nature does, which is grow many crops together and use our best efforts to make them mechanizable, or lower the labor requirement and the tedium involved in processing them, etc., by using digital technology. So why not put the best technologies at diversification rather than the best technologies at doing more of the same better?
Right, I have a question from the online, from Yu Shang Gan. Thank you so much. Just a quick question. To what extent do you think consumers, especially in countries with high consumption, play a role in driving the demand to produce the new crops? How can we encourage consumers to try new types?
So
new crops?
The answer is in the consumer's hands, because without consumers wanting to change, it's like 5 a day, or it's like all the other things we tell them is good for them. But at the end of the day, if consumers don't want to change, it's very hard for us to change habits. So they must want to eat these foods. But that doesn't mean, there are leading edges now where people are actually looking at more diverse foods, and they're looking at ingredients much more closely, and they say, actually, I want something which has a large. One of the things we developed, which we haven't released, is an app to look at the carbon footprint of my meal and the water content, the water used to produce this food. And if you can make decisions based on that, that doesn't go the whole way, but it actually encourages you to make decisions, wiser decisions about the food you're eating. It doesn't have to be a strawberry imported by air from California in December. We shouldn't eat strawberries in December. We should be growing foods that are in season, and we eat those seasonal foods. So those sorts of cultures have to change. The other thing I think is we can do it in two ways. We can increase the ingredients that we put into foods people are familiar with, so we don't scare the horses. People eat what they're familiar with, but the ingredients now are coming from wider source. And we can introduce them to new foods. And people are ready to eat new foods, but they need a narrative around those foods. Rather than just, here's a food, eat it, or here, it tastes nice. What about saying, this comes from farmers grown in Senegal, women farmers in Senegal have produced this crop, and we're now making those products that you can eat here. And in Canada, there's a very good company that actually does that. It literally imports from fields, location-specific, blockchain traceability of fields in West Africa to consumers in Canada. And people are paying the premium to actually eat those foods. And it's not going to be everybody, but you can see a direction of travel there.
I was thinking when you were talking about rice that you have a big cultural issue there, because in China, when they meet you, they say, have you eaten rice yet? I mean, it's actually coded into the language.
Yes. Well, it's a work in progress. We're not going to change all of China's eating habits, but we're not so familiar with rice. It's only 2 generations since rice became part of a European diet. And we now start saying, well, it's rice, but actually fonio is called hungry rice, not because people are so poor they can't eat rice. It tastes very good, but they haven't been introduced to it. And it's hungry rice because you want to eat more of it. That's the tradition. It's called hungry rice because you're hungry for it. So these ideas can actually, and of course, we aren't very good at narrative and marketing and promotion. These sorts of things have to have a story that people who are professional at storytelling, rather than scientists, can actually not defend, but present the case for diversification out of people's wish to look at it, but not something which they've actually been introduced to. Sorry.
I was just wondering, maybe it is just driven by how do you support farmers actually crops, like growing some obscure crop could be quite scary. Is it buy it, or they won't know how to grow it and they'll lose their yield that year and their income?
That's why we produce crop-based, because we want to reduce the risk to them. They've got skin in the game. At the end of the day, they're being told, grow this crop, and if you grow it, you'll get a yield, and then you'll get a market. So we've got to do the whole value chain. And one thing which we insisted when we set up Crops of Future is it wouldn't be a disciplinary silo, what we call a research value chain. So we started at genetics, which was the wrong end, actually. We started at genetics to market, but now all our products are market to genetics. So the pipeline is actually, what products do people want? And if you go down any supermarket aisle and you go, oh, there's 30, Tesco's will say, we've got 30,000 food products. Well, actually, they're the same 4 crops. And you just test it. Go down the supermarket aisle and look at all the cereal packets and look at the ingredients. And they're the same. We just made them into a different shape or a different color or whatever. Now, they are the people who we have to persuade. There's a market for these new crops in products that people will eat. So it's not an easy job, but that's why I've said we have to do it rather than it would be a nice thing to do.
Yeah.
You talked about the Green Revolution. What sort of time period was that where we went down to the 4 crops? And the second part of it, talk about forgotten, the 7,000 crops you're talking about. How many are currently grown somewhere in the world?
Most of them are grown somewhere in the world, but they're grown on such a small scale that there's no data or that people don't provide the evidence on them. The big crops became It's odd because that's what happened in the 60s. It called the Green Revolution, was a newspaper article where an American reporter flew over India, and he saw green everywhere he looked below the aircraft, because these new varieties were now being introduced, rice and wheat particularly. And he said, below me, I see a green carpet. I see a green revolution in front of me. Well, it was in its time a revolution. We wouldn't call it green now. And, and it did a huge amount in terms of increasing food, but it did very little in terms of nutrition. And of course, we didn't measure its impacts, the negative externalities of the Green Revolution. So, to quote a former Prime Minister of the UK, it was the future once, but it's not the future now. And that's why revolutions come to an end. And we have to sort of jump off that bandwagon, because the economic persistence of growing these crops only makes the cost of growing them even more, because you have to put more water, more fertilizer, more chemicals on them to produce crops on poorer and poorer soils, whereas we should be switching out when those crops are failing more often than they're succeeding.
I was just wondering, because you mentioned the dependence on vernacular knowledge, so you get a bit of input data about how you then translate that back in the way that pieces of the
So the app actually puts it into English, which is obviously one of the languages, but it's not the only language. And the vernacular knowledge is donated to us, if you like. We haven't got an incentive for people. Why should they give us all their knowledge of their crops? And if they do, what can we give them back? And that's why we say, well, we will help you with your crops that you can grow, particularly this horizontal exchange. If you go down whenever we've gone to countries and say, well, you should be growing your local crops, they go, they're on such a small scale, it's not worth it. But if they looked across Africa or across the tropics, and it's grown on a small scale in 25 countries, that collectively, but we don't. We look that way and say, oh, it's not the highest yielding crop that we can grow here. Now that's the knowledge is, again, very valuable if you can exchange it rather than just store it. And that's really what we're trying to do here, is make it accessible to people. Now, it's not literally an app that farmers can tap into, but they could do with good data science. And good ways of, so it's more useful for planners, policymakers at this stage, but it's all about technology. Can we make it accessible to farmers to make those decisions?
Is there right now like a policy to incentivize the growing of these crops? Because, for example, some farmers actually need to buy every year doing other crops because, crops that are modified to have a greater yield.
Yes.
Won't continue to function.
I think countries are now beginning to look again and saying our systems are not working. We're incentivizing the wrong. We're providing crops that make people ill. We're providing food that makes them unhealthy. And our diets are killing us. And if you say obesity, there's more obese people than undernourished people on the planet. And for the first time, and it wasn't just COVID, poverty has increased in the last 5 years. Malnutrition has increased. 1 in 5 children in the world are stunted or wasted. That, when you're stunted, you grow up to be stunted. You don't unstunt a child by giving them good food when they're 20. So as soon as you've done that with poor micronutrient deficient diets, you've stunted them for life. You've made them, mentally, physically, and psychologically impaired. Those are the decisions governments have to make, because they're going to have to pick up the bill. Because the food industry is not paying the bill for stunting. It's not paying the bill for waste. It's not paying the bill for obesity, is it?
Well, one last question. I think you had one, didn't you?
Just on the impacts of bringing indigenous crops, I think both positive and negative, is that considered as part of the process? We talked about soil generation and enriching the soil.
Yes.
But looking at the wider ecosystem and biodiversity.
Well, it's enhancing with, what we'd call, we've gone straight to biodiversity, which is great because we want to conserve biodiversity and protect the rainforest and natural biodiversity. We haven't said much about conserving agricultural biodiversity. And these crops are part of agricultural biodiversity, especially if they're part of a more mixed cultivation system. In terms of negatives, most of the negatives are the hard to cook, the energy required to cook these crops. Sometimes the seeds are very hard, which makes them very difficult for weevils and insects to destroy, but you then have to use a lot of energy, wood usually, to cook them, to make them edible. So we need technologies to overcome hard to cook. they've got anti-nutritional factors, sometimes they've got toxins. Now, these are all technical issues that we can address. Without investment and support, it's on a shoestring or it's a cottage industry, we're doing it one by one. What we really need is a global effort to say, we're going to invest. Which crops? Well, that's another decision, but at least we can give them some primary evidence that we don't say superfood, we never say that. We never say this is the next crop of the future. We just say this is an approach. You can decide which crops you actually want to work on. Once you decide, make sure that you actually support it long enough. So not give up after 2 years, because it's not there's no quick game here.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Saeed, and thank you all for attending and for all your questions. I've got a couple of notices to give out at the end of this meeting. First of all, if you want to know more about the Royal Meteorological Society East Midlands Centre and its activities, there's a sign-up sheet here. Just put your name and email address there, and we'll be in touch about future events and various other things. I do have one announcement about the next event. Also a local speaker, so we're doing our thing for presenting local expertise. Professor Paul Wunks from the University of Leicester. He is Chief Scientific Advisor for the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, and he's talking about net zero, how can science help policy? So if you're interested in that, it will be on the Royal Meteorological Society website, and you can sign up there either online or haven't decided yet whether we'll be doing a hybrid version of it or not, but definitely you can sign up. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you, Saeed. Once more. We had some trouble getting in, but I think it's easier to get out.
We think you still have to press a green button to get
Yes.
out.
Yeah.
You are allowed to leave.
I did manage to meet the security man with pain just
They locked the whole building up, do they? What about students?